Good morning. This is Mr. Young. This is our lesson on Washington's presidency. We've done this in class already, so nothing on this video is going to be new material. It's about 4 days worth of class material. If anything is new for you here as we're going through, make sure you write it down. I made this video so that you could study for your upcoming test, so please do so. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so we looked at the time before the Constitution. We had the Articles of Confederation, and we looked at the government that was behind the Articles of Confederation. And before we look at George Washington, I think it's important that we look at the Articles of Confederation and what they accomplished. Basically, the Articles of Confederation was a practice run for the government that was about to take shape. So the new government formed under the Constitution used the Articles of Confederation, what they accomplished, to help them do a better job with their government. We talked about to-do lists. What is a to-do list? A to-do list is a list of things that you need to get done, whether it be today, this week, this month, this year. Your to-do list are the things that you want to get accomplished, and the Articles of Confederation helped the government set up their own to-do list. If you were making your own country, we talked about some of the things that you would want to do. We made our lists of 10 things each on our whiteboards. Remember, we talked about taxes, roads, having a police force that could enforce laws, that kind of stuff. The new government, they took defense against the British and their allies as a matter of grave concern. Remember, this is the 30 years right after the Revolutionary War has ended. Another war with England is something that everyone's afraid of. The Revolution, the last battle, took place in August of 1782. The Articles of Confederation were written before that, and they went into effect before that. So the Revolutionary War was still a reality while this was going on. The Treaty of Paris, which was in 1783, was the document that officially ended the Revolutionary War. That's still 2 years away. And then this is an excerpt from the Articles of Confederation. The United States in Congress assembled shall have authority to appoint such other committees and civil officers as may be necessary for managing the general affairs of the United States under their direction, to appoint one of their members to preside, provided that no one person be allowed to serve in the office of President more than 1 year in any term of 3 years. And we talked about John Hanson, who was the President of the United States in Congress assembled under the Articles of Confederation. He was not the President of the United States, but the President of the United States in Congress assembled. Remember, at this time there is no executive branch, just a legislative branch. And then there's this cool picture I found of John Hanson. That statue is currently right outside the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and it's right next to the statue of George Washington. John Hanson served as President of the United States in Congress assembled from November 5th, 1781 until November 3rd, 1782. He removed all foreign troops from American lands as well as their flags. He also introduced the Treasury Department, the first Secretary of War, and the first Foreign Affairs Department. He led the fight to guarantee the statehood of the Western Territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains that had been controlled by some of the 13 original colonies. And we have our map of the colonies and the land that was given to the United States with the Treaty of Paris. That's on page 410 of your textbook, if you're following along with that at home. One cool fact about John Hanson, he is the guy who's responsible for establishing Thanksgiving Day as the fourth Thursday in November. So let's go back to that list. The main contribution that the Articles of Confederation had on the government that soon to be established afterwards was that it put together a large list of things that the government would need to do. We already did this in class. If you want to think of things that a government should do, you can go ahead, but this has already been covered in class, so don't worry too much about it. And then I went in and looked at the Articles of Confederation, the to-do list that they made, and I put the first three things that they came up with. By adjusting the mode and proportions of military aid to be furnished to a sister state laboring under invasion. If one state goes to war, how do other states help out? By describing the privileges and immunities to which the citizens of one state are entitled in another. If I, as a New York resident, go down to Pennsylvania, what rights do I have as a New York citizen in Pennsylvania? If I commit a crime in Pennsylvania, am I going to be tried in Pennsylvania, or do I get sent back to New York? By setting forth the conditions upon which a criminal is to be delivered up by one state upon the demand of the executive another. So if I go to Pennsylvania, commit a crime, and I then come back to New York, what rights does the Pennsylvania government have to prosecute me? Does New York have to send me back? It's things like this that we probably weren't coming up with on our own in class, but were very real problems because this is how laws are enforced in real life and in real countries. And today we see that with extradition laws, if somebody comes into the United States, commits a crime in the United States, and then leaves the United States, we'll see them being sometimes sent back to the United States so they can be punished. And that's very, very difficult area of law still today. The Articles of Confederation, they didn't really do too much, and many of the things on their to-do list were left to be formally established under the Constitution, which was ratified in, as we know, the year 1788. Everyone should know that by now. 1788 is when the Constitution went into effect. Now we're going to move into Washington's presidency. Washington began his presidency in 1789. John Adams was his vice president. At the time, there was no Washington, D.C. New York City was the nation's capital. These are some things that I'd like us to think about as we go forward in this video. Because remember, this was the video that we did on the very first day of this section, and now we're several weeks later, so maybe thinking about these questions again will help us to understand it better. What important developments occurred during George Washington's tenure, this time, as the first president of the United States? How did they affect the future of the U.S. of the president? As the president under the Constitution, the very first president, George Washington was constantly setting precedents. He did a lot to define and practice what was written in the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution was still just a theory at this point. It was written down, but it had no practical application yet. Washington gave a clear example to his government and to future presidents of how to fulfill the position of chief executive. Remember, Washington is the precedent president. Still difficult to say after all these weeks. Washington is the precedent president, and everything he does is new to the country. These are things that have never been done before, so he's setting an example of how the president should act as chief executive. We did this one already, and it's already been handed in. Thank you. Alright, now moving into the next section. This is day 3 of this lesson. This is chapter 9, section 1 in your textbook. If you are studying, I suggest that you be reading through your textbook in addition to just watching this video. One of Washington's great strengths as the president was his cabinet. Some of the prominent names on the cabinet were the Secretary of War, who was Henry Knox, the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and his Attorney General, his legal advisor, basically, was Edmund Randolph. There's no mention of the Constitution there's no mention of the cabinet in the Constitution, but Washington thought that he could not do all these things by himself. He knew his weaknesses as a human being, and he took them into account. So he enlisted people to come and help him. A lot of these people, as we'll see, did not get along, but Washington trusted them all as individuals. And we talked about this, that Hamilton and Jefferson did not get along. They had very different views on how the country should be run. Hamilton strongly urged President Washington to industrialize the country so that the United States could be economically competitive with Europe. Factories are still a brand new thing at this point, and they're nothing like the factories we have today. But Hamilton was kind of a visionary here. He knew that they would be needed, and he knew that they would help the country expand. Jefferson urged the president to focus more heavily on agriculture and education, both very important things, so that the new country could be self-sufficient and completely independent from Europe. Whereas Jefferson wanted complete independence from Europe, Hamilton wanted us to trade with Europe and to be competitive with Europe. Washington had to mediate feuds between the two often, but he still trusted both of them. Hamilton was a visionary when it came to fiscal policy. He wanted to make the country debt-free. There was a lot of debt that was incurred during the Revolutionary War, about $54 million of debt. Add inflation, and that's many trillion dollars of debt. We have, I think, the last time I looked at it, we had $19.7 trillion of debt today. This is probably a little bit more debt than that. Able to create revenue. He wanted to make the country able to create revenue. He put a lot of tariffs on imported goods. He also put taxes on domestic goods, as we'll see with whiskey in the Whiskey Rebellion. He wanted to use a national bank, a centralized institution that controlled the U.S. dollar. Today we know the National Bank, which was originally founded in 1791 as the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve took over for the National Bank after that closed. And the Federal Reserve, as we know it today, was officially founded in 1913. And the Fed is much closer to what Hamilton desired in a national bank than what he got during his lifetime. What he saw during his lifetime, he considered to be a failure. And the Federal Reserve is a much closer approximation of what he wanted. And remember, Hamilton died in 1804. He was shot by Aaron Burr, who was Thomas Jefferson's vice president. So you can still see that feud didn't end well for Hamilton. But the Federal Reserve didn't really come about until more than 100 years after Hamilton died. Problems with the Constitution. The Constitution was purposely written so that it would be flexible. We call it a living document. This led to confusion about what the federal government could and should do. For example, Jefferson and Madison believed that the Constitution did not give the government, the federal government at least, to have the power to create a national bank. Hamilton did see that the Constitution did this. It didn't expressly forbid it, so therefore it can happen. So the debate went on for over 100 years. Remember, we didn't really see the strong national bank that Hamilton envisioned until 1913. The heart of the matter is that there are many ways to interpret the Constitution. They break down into two different methods, a strict interpretation and a loose interpretation. Those that interpret the Constitution in a strict manner favor following the document exactly, not adding anything that is not explicitly mentioned. If the Constitution doesn't say it, you can't do it. That would be the cabinet. That would be the Federal Reserve. That is how a strict manner of interpretation would look at the Constitution. Then those that interpret the Constitution in a loose manner, they favor giving the government powers that might not be mentioned, but they are fitting with the themes and the spirit of the law. So we looked at the spirit of the law and what the spirit of the law actually is. It's the meaning that the people who wrote the Constitution wanted it to have. So why is the Constitution there? Why does Article 3 of the Constitution create the judicial branch? What does the judicial branch do that's in fitting with the rest of the Constitution? If all of those questions are answered and they're answered correctly, then a loose interpretation could say that you could have things that aren't actually mentioned in the Constitution because they don't contradict the Constitution. They are in keeping with the spirit of the law. So Washington's cabinet, it helped him to be a better president. They were his advisors. They weren't actually political officials. They were his advisors. So that doesn't contradict the Constitution. Alright, we talked about this in class already. If you want to come up with another example on your own, feel free to do so, but we're not going to cover it in this video. Washington's presidency. If you're in your textbook, that will be Chapter 9, Section 2. The Northwest Territory. Remember that map on page 410 of your textbook? You can see where Ohio and where Indiana is. That's the Northwest Territory that is in question here. And we know that the Treaty of Paris expanded the United States quite a bit. However, it didn't resolve all of those disputes. John Hanson did a good job of removing a lot of British troops from the United States, but all of them were removed from the Northwest Territory, as we will see. This is still new, and they still have not completely left the country. Some land in the Northwest was claimed by multiple countries: Spain, Great Britain, the United States, Native American tribes. They all had competing claims on this land. On paper, it belongs to the United States, but in reality, that's not what was happening. The biggest dispute was in the Northwest. Native Americans reacted violently to the expansionism of the United States. The United States is growing. There's a bigger population than ever before. We need more land. So the United States is growing. It's expanding. That's a policy of expansionism. Great Britain still had forts set up north of the Ohio River. And we looked at that in our books as well, where those forts were located. Remember who George Washington was. He was a general. He was a war hero. He fought for his country. He was a symbol of the birth of the United States. His experience was mostly in war and in leading armies. But now he has a different role. He is now the president. He knows that war, constant war, is going to destroy the country. He wants the country to have peace. So he has a tough decision to do. This is our land, on paper. The country needs this land. Does he let Native Americans keep the land and kill his people, or does he go to war against the Indians? He chose to go to war, and the big battle that we see here is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He might not have wanted to send the troops out there, but he figured that it would be best for his country and to secure the new frontier. War is not ever pleasant, but this was something that he was willing to do to help his country expand peacefully into the future. The Battle of Fallen Timbers took place in 1794. About 2,000 Native Americans were defeated in this battle. Those defeated Native Americans, they retreated to Fort Miami, which was a British fort just at the northern part of the Northwest Territories here in Ohio. The British refused to help the Native Americans. Instead of helping them, they were forced to negotiate with the United States, and the Treaty of Greenville was established. So the Native Americans basically were forced to sign over their land to the United States. So yes, it was already signed over to the United States by Great Britain, but now the same land is being signed over to the United States by the Native Americans. The British refused to help because they wanted to avoid another war with the United States. Just like the U.S. was exhausted from the Revolution, England was exhausted from the Revolution. They couldn't do another war. We also talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was just another instance of where Washington needed to deploy troops and make tough decisions. Part of Hamilton's tax plan, remember, through the National Bank, he needed to eliminate debt. So he found things to tax, and whiskey was one of them. Whiskey was seen as a sin tax, if you want to call it that, was placed on it, but also because it was such a popular thing. There was so much of it, and it was being used as currency that the government felt they had the right to tax this. And we see that with a lot of things in our culture today. Cigarettes have a tax on it. Pretty much everything that you go to a store to buy, if you go to buy clothes at the mall, there will be tax on that. And that all goes back to the government. Some of it to the county, some of it to the state, but this was a national tax at this point. Many farmers relied on selling the grain used to make whiskey for their income, and sometimes they even used the whiskey itself as money. So the tax hurt them quite a bit. In Pennsylvania, many farmers banded together to protest this tax, and when a tax collector came by, they tarred and feathered him. Imagine having hot tar dumped on you and then feathers stuck to it, so you look like a giant bird. It's pretty embarrassing and pretty painful, too. The army arrested 20 of those farmers, some of whom were barefoot. And we talked about, why do I mention they're barefoot? Why is that important? Because it shows how poor they were. This tax really hurt them, and they were so poor they couldn't afford shoes. So this tax really hurt them badly, and the United States stepped in by sending the army. Remember, there's no police force yet at this time, so the army is effectively acting as a police unit. Was the shutdown of the Whiskey Rebellion just? Was it fair? What do you think? We talked about this a little bit. We talked about how maybe it wasn't quite fair, but how the government also needed to show that it was strong. You've already written down your answers in class. You've already defended them in class. You all did a great job. Thank you. If anything, the Whiskey Rebellion showed U.S. citizens that the government was to be taken seriously. For some, it created a fear of government. In others, it created a very deep respect for the new government. We talked about how the ends, do they justify the means? If you have some great goal, is it okay to do bad things? We talked about, no, it's not. He wants us to have good intentions and do the right thing. Because even if the things that we do don't have immediate negative consequences, Jesus can see what our heart was, what our intent was. And we looked at a few biblical examples of where people are doing good things. The Pharisees, standing out in the streets and praying. Praying is a good thing. We're called to pray in the Bible. It's a good thing. But if we're not sincere, if we're doing it just to show off and not to honor God, then it's not right. And then we finished up our talk with the French Revolution. The French Revolution began in 1789 after a financial crisis led to an uprising in France. Pretty much the same thing that was happening in the United States. It means the colonists were being taxed, and they rose up against their government. The peasants were being taxed in France. They rose up against their government. So you see the American Revolution was a big inspiration for the French Revolution. And most Americans supported the French uprising. It was a very violent war, though. A lot of people were killed. This is where the guillotine, you may have heard of that, was introduced. In 1793, the King of France, Louis XVI, was executed. France fought against Britain, Holland, and Spain at this point. This put the U.S. in a bad spot, especially because France was our ally during the American Revolution. They helped us fight the British. But if we were to help France fight against the British, there's potential for another war here, too. Many critics of Washington called him a hypocrite. Sorry, my cat just jumped on me if you heard her squealing. They argued that he wasn't prepared to defend his beliefs and that he was unfit as president because of this. We talked about how Washington's beliefs really hadn't changed. He did sympathize with the French, but his beliefs haven't changed, but his role in government has changed. He's no longer a military general. He's the leader of his country. He has to think about things more than just winning wars. He has to think about everybody in the country. And so in 1793, the United States, Washington said that we would not take part in the French Revolution. It established a precedent of isolationism that lasted about 100 years. And this is really the time where the United States is showing its neutrality. It's going to be really hard to keep this up, as we will see throughout this class. The United States was being attacked by English ships. They were seizing goods, imprisoning soldiers. This led to the War of 1812. So even as far back as 1793, we're seeing the root causes of the War of 1812. Jay's Treaty was considered a failure because the UK decided not to pay back a lot of the damages that were incurred. So it's another challenge to Washington's strength as president. And if you want to learn more about Jay's Treaty, and then there was also another treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, you can look at that as well. That's on page 302 of your textbook.